Israelis give land, the Palestinians give peace. The biggest obstacle to peace has been sheer opposition to it by both some Arabs and some Israelis.
He was a huge icon for the Palestinian people. There's no doubt about that at all, and whatever differences we had with him, I think it's right to recognise that. I think the most important thing is to make sure that we reinvigorate the peace process.
Which Yasser Arafat will you remember, statesman or terrorist? That debate, like most in the Middle East, is likely to continue for decades to come. And to make sense of it all, we've invited our friend, the brilliant writer, world traveler, and feared iconoclast Christopher Hitchens, whose new collection of essays is called Love, Poverty, and War. Christopher, I am more confused than ever about the distinction between terrorist and statesman. So Yasser Arafat dies this week after decades of sponsoring terrorism, and the Vatican, of all places, issues a statement essentially praising him as a statesman and expressing pain at his passing. Which was he, terrorist or statesman?
Well, his achievement is, if we're going to be generous for a second to the departed, is a cosmological one, I would say. Until, at any rate, the '67 war, and maybe sometime afterwards, people thought of it as Israel versus the Arabs. In other words, there's this tiny Jewish state, and then there's this huge sea of Arabs and Muslims around it, and everyone's feeling of natural identification with the underdog kicks in. After the work of Arafat internationally, it more and more became obvious that it was Israel versus the Palestinians. In other words, it was two quite small peoples in this quite small land who had to find a way of sharing it one way or another. And he did shift the dialogue. It became Israel versus the Palestinians. But he did it at a huge price. I mean, the first of which was to identify the cause of Palestine with someone swarthy, unshaven, unscrupulous, who toted a rod on the podium of the United Nations.
Murderous, too.
But while talking about olive branches, and never could seem to make up his mind. As for terrorism, look, I mean, the fact is that international law guarantees people the right to resist if they are under occupation. It doesn't mean they are entitled to do anything.
Right.
There are certain things that are crimes by any definition.
Like kill Olympic athletes.
But that's why people sometimes hesitate to use the word terrorist flat out, or use it on
But post 9/11, I mean, aren't we in an age where we have to draw clear distinctions between legitimate political resistance and terrorism?
Well, that's why I think the chairman's first act, Chairman Arafat's first act, widely photographed. You may remember it was to be photographed giving blood for the victims of 9/11. He wanted as clearly as he could to try and take advantage of that distinction. But he could never do it convincingly. By the way, I don't know who got that blood, but I hope they threw it away.
Well, I don't, yeah. Excellent point. There's this sort of weird contradiction in the way people seem to be remembering him. At least the first editions of his obituary seem to say this, that he was this great man, a leader of his people, repository of the hopes and aspirations of the Palestinians, and yet only now that he's dead do the Palestinians possibly have a hope of actually getting a state.
His corruption, for example, was quite extraordinary, and a lot of the row that there will be among the Palestinians now is what happened to all this money? Did it go into his personal bank account? Almost certainly it did. He set up about 3 extra militias to try and control the Palestinians on top of the existing occupation. I mean, he made Gaza into more of a police state prison than it was already. Of the Arab leaders, his closest relationship was probably with Saddam Hussein in the last few years. He self-identified with dictators. He was a dictator before he had a state to rule over. These are all terrible things to be saying about a dead guy, but they're all true. And all the Palestinians basically know this, but they don't like to denounce the chairman or see him denounced by others.
Now, Arafat died in France, where he was probably more popular than he was in, say, Egypt.
Indeed.
Arafat was genuinely popular in France because he was seen as this indigenous leader, this revolutionary leader, spokesman for his people. And yet the French, amazingly, from my point of view, this week essentially invaded the Ivory Coast, blew up the Ivory Coast Air Force, I think both planes,
yeah.
In defense or in response to this attack on, I think, 8 or 9 Legionnaires. Is this hypocritical? France reserves the right to invade other countries when it wants to, but denounces other nations when they do that? What's the standard?
It's such a wonderful target, but someone has to do it. French unilateralism has always been a huge factor on its own. They claim the right to explode nuclear weapons for testing in the atmosphere in French Polynesia, which is one of their rundown colonies in the Pacific, not caring about the fallout, and they claimed the right to murder the crew of the Greenpeace vessel, the Rainbow Warrior, which went to protest about this. They blew up that ship, killing one of its crew in the harbour of New Zealand, which is, respectable democracy. In Africa, they have what they call la francophonie, in other words, the former French colonies of Africa who have their own economies still tied to France, and where France intervenes at will militarily. They intervened militarily in Rwanda to try and keep going the government, the genocide government that they had installed there. They go into Ivory Coast without so much as a by your leave. I've been in Côte d'Ivoire. You have to spend a lot of time there proving to people that you're not French. Which is actually, with my French, it's fairly easy to do. But they look at you and they want to be sure you're not French. Same in Congo, by the way. It's the last really aggressively colonial European power. And it doesn't ever, though it is a member of the Permanent Five of the UN Security Council, it never seeks UN permission for any of its
Well, and they didn't even seek parliamentary permission for this move. Now, the Ivory Coast...
And if a leader of any of these countries is elected who they don't like, they usually have him assassinated. There used to be a man, Michel Foucault was his name, whose cabinet-level job it was to do coups and assassinations in French Africa.
Christopher Hitchens, thank you.
Sure.